Yes, thank you for the kind presentation, and thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. It's a great pleasure to be here in Stockholm and to have the opportunity to speak about the ethical ambivalence of markets. I distributed a handout. There are 2 Hegel quotes and 6 theses on the handout. When I refer to items on the handout, I will notice you about that in advance. Some 25 years ago, market institutions enjoyed the highest reputation. Okay.
I think people in the back already have it. It's in the front here. Sorry.
The ethical ambivalence of markets. Some 25 years ago, market institutions enjoyed the highest reputation. After the fin d'une illusion, which communism embodied for so many people, it seemed there was no rational alternative to markets. Market systems were preferred not only on the grounds of productivity, but also because they were taken to provide effective protection for individual freedoms and a just distribution of collectively produced goods and services. The acceptance of markets was so widespread that an academic who had hitherto been known only in specialist circles could launch a worldwide debate by arguing that democratic and market-based societies constituted the final stage of historical development. In this context, it was not surprising that markets also displayed an enormous growth in social significance. Economies which had hitherto been structured as planned economies received market forms of organization. Already existing markets were freed from state intervention, and market institutions gained entry into social spheres where they had never been previously considered, for example, health and education systems. Markets, so it seemed, were beneficent institutions with a capacity to solve almost every social problem. The euphoria of those days is gone. Since the outbreak of the global economic crisis in 2008, markets are increasingly perceived as institutions which cause or aggravate social problems. This view is based on numerous observations. For instance, the widening gap between rich and poor and the concentration of economic wealth in the hands of a few, the increase in precarious employment conditions and ways of life, the return of poverty, even among children, the increase in psychological problems amongst the employed, or the rise in public debt, which severely constrains local and national governments' ability to act. In the light of developments such as these, markets appear to be institutions which undermine society and harm states. How should we view markets? This question, which for a long time was only of minor interest to political and social philosophers, is now the subject of lively philosophical debate. This discussion connects contemporary philosophy with the philosophy of the 18th and 19th centuries, which focused on both ethical and social theoretical questions related to markets. This is also true famously of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. As I would like to show in my presentation, Hegel gave an answer to the question just posed, how should we view markets, that is well worth considering today. Hegel believes that in ethical respects, and I use the term ethical to render Hegel sittlich, and I will explain what I take him to mean by that. So Hegel believes that in ethical respects, markets are ambivalent, and he considers this ambivalence to be a fundamental problem of modern societies. This viewpoint of Hegel's is what I will explore in my talk today. The starting point of my discussion is Hegel's thesis that the members of modern, or in Hegel's terminology, civil societies, have a specific ethical disposition, sittliche Gesinnung. In what follows, I will first set out what this disposition consists in. That will be the first part of my talk. before explaining why markets, when measured in terms of this disposition, are ethically ambivalent. That will be the second part of my talk. And finally, in part 3, I will show why Hegel assumes the ethical ambivalence of markets to be a fundamental problem of modern societies, and briefly consider how I might deal with his viewpoint. I should like to add that I will not, throughout my lecture, talk about Marx nor about contemporary critical theory. When I submitted the subtitle, I was unaware of the fact that I had no more than 30 minutes, and I was also unaware of the time I would need to construct Hegel's viewpoint. But having said this, I will be happy to answer questions related to Marx or to contemporary critical theory if you would like to ask them in the discussion section. Part 1. Hegel believes that in Europe within his lifetime a new type of... Can you hear me? Because I... Is that, okay. So Hegel believes that in Europe within his lifetime a new type of society was forming, civil society, which he termed bürgerliche Gesellschaft. The origins of civil society leading back to the political and economic upheavals of the late 18th and early 19th century, notably the French Revolution and the spread of industrialization from England. As Hegel emphasizes in the philosophy of right, civil societies differ from other types of society not only in institutional terms. Their members also have a specific ethical disposition, sittliche Gesinnung, which distinguishes them from members of other societies. And I'll turn to the first quote on the handout. Hegel writes, "The ethical disposition is therefore that each individual, by a process of self-determination, makes himself a member of one of the moments of civil society through his activity, diligence, and skill, and supports himself in this capacity. And only through this mediation with the universal does he simultaneously provide for himself and gain recognition in his own eyes and in the eyes of others." End quote. How is this to be understood? With regard to the meaning of individual expressions, the following must first be established. When Hegel talks about a human being, or as he would see it, a male human being, that makes himself a member of one of the moments of civil society and provides for himself only through this mediation with the universal, he means that the person in question secures his livelihood by manufacturing goods or offering services which other members of society can use, a process which takes place within the framework of society's division of labor. But why does Hegel say that the individual in a civil society has an ethical disposition to learn and exercise a profession and to secure his livelihood by helping to secure the livelihood of others? And why does the individual thereby gain recognition in his own eyes and in the eyes of others? As I want to show, the ethical disposition of members of civil society can be characterized on the basis of 6 elements. A slightly formalized description of these elements will clarify matters. Element number 1. That's the longer version, the slightly formalized version, which is on the handout, will follow. For any given member of a civil society, it is important that he learns and exercises a profession through his own self-determination and activity, and that he thereby not only secures his own livelihood, but also helps to secure the livelihood of others. Or, in a slightly formalized manner, element E1, and that's the version you find on the handout, for a member of a civil society, it is important to do X. The second element reads, A has the conviction that doing X is also important to other members of society, B, C, and so on. Element E3, A, B, C, and so on take the view that they should each do X insofar as it is possible. Element E4, when A does X, it is important for A to be recognized by B, C, and so on for doing so. Element E5, when B, C, and so on do X, then A is willing to recognize them for doing so. and element E6, A, B, C, and so on, take the view that each of them should be recognized by the others when he does X. To explain, for A, doing X is an activity that figures in his conception of a good life. If A could not do X, he would think that his life was incomplete. But why is this so? A lives in a society where the division of labor is such that no one person alone can produce the goods they need to secure their livelihood. On the contrary, almost all the goods A needs are produced by other members of society. In this situation, it is important for A to acquire the goods he needs to secure his livelihood in exchange for goods which he has produced and which will help other members of society to secure their livelihood. Now, the activity which enables A to do what is important for him is X. This is why A views doing X as an essential element of the kind of life he wishes to live. It follows that A does not merely take up an occupation to have money for his own use. What is also important for him is to engage in an activity that helps other members of society to satisfy their needs and secure their livelihood. For this reason, A would not view gifts or donations from other people or the state as equivalent to the money earned through work within the framework of society's division of labor. As these considerations show, A has an evaluative and a volitional practical attitude that helps him to structure his own life. This attitude allows him, for instance, to assess the aims he might have, to accept or reject them, and to judge possible acts as either appropriate or inappropriate in accordance with the requirements of doing X. This attitude has a significant impact on A's self-understanding and practical identity. In a civil society, it is not merely important for A to do X. A also assumes that doing X is important for the other members of society. He would be surprised, even amazed, if he were to discover that B or C have absolutely no interest in doing X. Moreover, A, as well as B and C, thinks that it is normatively right that each of them, if possible, performs X. A, along with B and C, is thereby equipped with a standard which allows him to classify his own behavior and that of others as either good or bad, as praiseworthy or blameworthy, depending on whether it fulfills or undermines the norm in question. It is noteworthy here that this norm claims that every member of society should do X, provided they are able to do so. Persons for whom it is impossible to do X, for instance, as a result of a disability, do not undermine the norm if they don't do X. As already noted, members of civil society are ready to recognize each other for doing X, and they consider it appropriate or normatively right that people who do X are to be recognized for doing so. Moreover, it is important for them to be recognized if they do X. These elements, E4 through E6, of the attitude held by the members of civil society must relate to an activity that is only achieved through some effort. If, for instance, doing X consisted merely in greeting work colleagues each morning, it could not, at least under normal conditions, be a fitting basis for recognition. By contrast, doing X involves learning and practicing a profession to secure one's own livelihood by helping to secure the livelihood of other people. Doing X, therefore, is an extended and complex activity whose success requires effort and determination. As such, doing X constitutes a suitable basis for recognition, a recognition that can be grounded in various aspects of the activity in question, such as the technical skills needed to carry it out, or its particular usefulness for other members of society. To sum up, when Hegel talks about the ethical dispositions of members of civil society, he is referring to an attitude that can be characterized by the elements just discussed. As explained, such an attitude has evaluative, normative, and volitional practical elements, as well as convictions relating to the existence of these elements, in oneself and other persons. As is evident from the preceding reflections, such an attitude has considerable influence on people's self-understanding, their way of life, and the social relations they entertain with one another. In view of the aims I am pursuing here, we need to consider further what Hegel means when he says that an individual engages in a process of self-determination when becoming and maintaining himself as a member of a moment or a professional sector of civil society. Alongside Hegel's statement I have just analyzed, another passage from the Philosophy of Right sheds light on this issue. And you find that passage also on the handout. In a civil society, Hegel states, the ultimate and essential determinant is subjective opinion and the particular arbitrary will, which are accorded their right, their merit, and their honor in this sphere. Thus, what happens in this sphere is at the same time mediated by the arbitrary will, and for the subjective consciousness, it has the shape of being the product of its own will, end quote. Now, what must be in play is for a person A to become and maintain and remain a member of a moment of civil society through a process of self-determination. For a start, there has to be a decision-making situation. The prevailing social situation cannot be one wherein who does what job is determined by factors like social background or ethnicity. It also must not be the case that another person or institution either decides what work A must carry out or compels him to agree to undertake certain work. In fact, A must be entitled to become a member of any of the various and distinct moments of civil society, a provision that is satisfied if there are no laws or customs prohibiting A from pursuing specific professional activities. Moreover, A must be entitled to act on specific vocational choices in accordance with his opinion and preferences, what Hegel calls his particular arbitrary will. And A must not be obliged to have his reasons for or against a professional activity disclosed, discussed, or scrutinized. Only if these conditions are met can A and his fellow citizens have the conviction that the respective professional activity by which A becomes and maintains himself as a member of a moment of civil society is the product of his own will. And only then will they be of the conviction that for any individual A, the activity is one that he exercises by a process of self-determination. Part 2. What exactly do these considerations have to do with markets? That depends, of course, on what one understands by market. Like many economists, Hegel never attempts to define the term. Nevertheless, he develops reflections which make clear that he takes markets to be market economic systems structured by civil law, or as he says, by abstract law. And that means that Hegel shares a modern conception of markets that is influenced by Adam Smith and other economists of his time. From these reflections, one can gather the sense in which and the reasons why Hegel believes that markets are ambivalent in ethical terms. As I will now show, Hegel believes that markets have qualities which promote the formation or preservation of the ethical disposition of members of civil society, while he simultaneously believes that markets have other qualities which endanger the formation or preservation of the same disposition. That markets have these qualities is explained by Hegel by reference to markets' ethical and legal framework, as well as the manner in which markets function. Let me explain this. On the one hand, recognition effectively takes place in markets. As a market participant, an individual is recognized by other participants and by social institutions as a person, and I stress in the Hegelian sense of the word, and as an owner of property. In fact, People who exchange goods in markets take each other to be entitled to make decisions independently from one another regarding whether and on what terms they wish to buy or sell the things that they own. They also take each other to be entitled to make decisions independently of one another regarding whether and on what terms they wish to offer services to or demand services from other market participants. Moreover, they do not take themselves to be obliged to go into the reasons for their respective decisions. Because this is so, the exchange of goods or services in markets takes place when the participating parties want it to take place. Only when they reach an agreement does such an exchange actually come about. Such an event is thus accompanied by the experience of being recognized by one's contracting partners as a person, again in the Hegelian sense of the word, and a property owner. At the same time, people who carry out exchanges with one another in markets are recognized institutionally. The organs of civil or abstract right, to use Hegel's words again, give a legal framework to the powers which market participants grant each other, as well as to the corresponding prohibitions, Hegel's terms. These institutions solve disputes between market participants by legal means and ensure that contractual agreements are adhered to. By exercising these tasks, the organs of abstract right ensure that market participants have, as persons and property owners, valid actuality. Hegel's words. This is why people who exchange in markets can be said to be recognized by the institutions of state and society. Markets thereby strengthen one element of citizens' ethical disposition, the self-determination with which professional activities are pursued. That is, as market participants, people know that they are entitled to become members of the different moments or professional sectors of civil society, and that they can act with respect to specific professional options in accordance with their own opinions and preferences, Hegel's particular arbitrary will, without having to disclose the reasons for their respective decisions. In this sense, markets are institutions that can make positive contributions to the formations or maintenance of the ethical disposition characteristic of members of civil society. On the other hand, Hegel thinks that a market economy of the type described so far has also properties that endanger the formation and maintenance of citizens' ethical dispositions. Hegel gives reasons for this standpoint in his Jena writings on social philosophy, in particular in the so-called System of Ethical Life and the Philosophy of Spirit, a lecture manuscript from 1805-1806. Some of the arguments he develops there can be summarized in 5 points. Point number 1. A market economic system cannot ensure that each person in fact can make himself a member of one of the moments of civil society through his activity, diligence, and skill, and support himself in this capacity. For Hegel, the absence of this assurance stems from several possibilities. Market participants may simply lack or be unable to acquire the requisite qualifications for particular professional occupations. Changes in the demand for goods and services may cause large fluctuations in prices and at least temporarily lead to unemployment. And technological innovations may cause long-term reductions in employment levels within particular sectors. In addition, Hegel believes, and he here follows Adam Smith, that in the long run, a market economic system of the kind I have described favors the emergence of monopolies, that is, businesses that have the power to reduce the supply of goods and jobs in accordance with their own interests and to the detriment of the public. Circumstances like these can make it impossible for members of a civil society to practice a given professional activities and to live in accordance with their ethical dispositions. Point number 2. Market economic relations cannot ensure that persons who pursue professional activities can thereby earn an income with which to secure their livelihood. For Hegel, this assessment follows directly from his reflections on price formation processes. The fact that markets tend, by a process of unconscious necessity, towards an equilibrium of supply and demand for goods implies that there are periods in which such an equilibrium does not exist. This entails that producers of goods may not always be able to secure their livelihood through professional activity. In the present context, these possibilities are relevant because the ethical disposition characterizing members of civil societies requires that the individual provides for himself only through this mediation with the universal, that is, through his professional activity. If Hegel is correct, then markets may not always meet these requirements, even when people are employed. Point number 3. A market economy cannot ensure that professional activities as such possess the types of qualities that make possible and sustain the relevant ethical dispositions among members of civil society. Certainly, a great deal of work that generates market prices can only be exercised by persons with specific professional qualifications and judgment. However, there are also paid jobs with undemanding content that require little or no decision-making from employees. Hegel himself makes this clear in his treatment of factory work, which consists in the continual performance of simple manual movements. In his judgment, such work simply cannot give the worker a basis for the consciousness that he is making himself into a member of civil society through his own activity and skill. On the contrary, the limitation of such job profile encourages self-perceptions that are negative in both evaluative and normative terms. In Hegel's view, persons in such employment tend to regard themselves as subordinate and dependent, and even in some cases start to develop, I quote, an inability to feel and enjoy the wider freedoms and particularly the spiritual advantages of civil society, end quote. Point number 4. A market economy cannot ensure that a professional can intentionally make himself a member of one of the moments of civil society through his own activity, diligence, and skill, nor that he can support himself in this capacity. As I already said, a member of a civil society lives in accordance with his disposition when he acts upon his decision to acquire economically relevant qualifications and to apply them in the context of a particular professional activity. But what if, even with respect to the near future, one simply cannot foresee the qualifications that will be relevant? In that case, it would, strictly speaking, be impossible for a person, by acquiring certain qualifications, to make himself a member of one of the moments of civil society through his own activity, diligence, and skill, and to support himself in this capacity. Granted, he may decide to acquire specific skills, and if it turned out that these qualifications became socially superfluous, he could always try to acquire other job-related skills. But under these circumstances, he would not be able to form long-term career plans which relate to the acquisition and exercise of qualifications within the context of a given professional activity. His professional life would thus run the risk of being so fragmented that it would fail to meet the requirements of the relevant ethical dispositions among the members of civil society. On Hegel's view, markets can develop in such a way that they make professionals into a plaything of fluctuations in prices that can barely be foreseen. But if someone who decides to acquire professional skills finds themselves, as Hegel puts it, in the position of a gambler, Spieler, then they cannot regard any professional success they might have as merited, rather only as a mere coincidence, Hegel's word. In that case, however, it will be impossible for them to realize the structure of recognition characteristic of the ethical disposition held by members of civil society, my elements E4, E5, and E6. For this reason, markets may create circumstances in which professionals, no matter what they earn, cannot live in accordance with the salient ethical dispositions. Point number 5. A market system cannot prevent positions of power from forming that in turn affect its functioning and legal framework in a way that undermines the ethical disposition I have analyzed. As already indicated, Hegel thinks that in the long run, such a system encourages the emergence of monopolies. Such monopolies pose a danger that the equality of market participants before the law will no longer be a given. This would have severe repercussions for the ethical dispositions in general. In his lectures on the philosophy of right from the years 1821 and 1822, Hegel uses drastic words. I quote, "The rabble, der Pöbel, need not solely be on the side of the poor, as is usually supposed, but can also be on the side of the rich, who can be just as mob-like. There is a rich rabble, because wealth is a power, and this power of wealth easily becomes a power over the law. The rich can get away with a great deal that would bring shame to anyone else. One can call this depravity, that the rich take everything to be permissible," end quote. From these reflections, which I have laid out in 5 points, Hegel draws the following conclusion. Sooner or later, in any market economy structured by civil law, developments will occur which make it impossible for many citizens to live in accordance with their ethical dispositions. Some will even lose these dispositions altogether. In such a scenario, society is faced with the prospect in such a scenario, society is faced with people with no prospect of employment, who cannot make a living from their work, who are engaged in monotonous and deadening labor, and who have no chance of forging a career, but instead drift from one job to the next. These people will not perceive themselves as living in a society where individuals can make themselves a member of one of the moments of that society and support themselves in this capacity through their own activity, diligence, and skill. On the contrary, such people are likely to believe that the distribution of jobs and incomes boils down to mere coincidences or arbitrary decision. This, however, will make it impossible for them to gain recognition in their own eyes and in the eyes of many others when they actually do X. Consequently, they will develop an attitude that is different from the disposition characteristic of members of civil society and which may, as Hegel suspects, extend to inward rebellion against the rich, against society, the government, and so on, end quote. Part 3. For Hegel, these reflections on the ethical ambivalence of markets are of major social philosophical significance. In his view, they are apt to draw our attention to a fundamental problem of modern societies. What this problem consists in and why he believes modern societies are afflicted by it can be shown by referring to 3 points from his Jena writings and the philosophy of right. Point number 1. The ethical dispositions of members of civil society has one element, namely the entitlement to learn and perform an occupation by a process of self-determination, which can be institutionally secured only through abstract right and through markets structured by it. Point number 2. Wherever abstract right and markets structured by it are the key institutions of society, sooner or later economic developments will occur which remove from many individuals the possibility to make themselves, by a process of self-determination, a member of one of the moments of civil society through their own activity, diligence, and skill, and support themselves in this capacity. This in turn will threaten the maintenance of their ethical disposition. Point number 3, the state cannot eliminate this danger. Since states cannot reliably predict market developments nor the precise effects of economic policies, they risk failing their goal when they attempt to ensure that every person makes themselves a member of one of the moments of civil society. and supports themselves in this capacity. Moreover, at least some of the measures taken by governments to this end have a more or less restrictive effect on people's entitlement to learn and practice a profession by a process of self-determination. Thus, states are actors whose action may prove not merely ineffective, but even a threat to the ethical disposition of members of civil society. From these 3 points, the first and third of which go beyond what I have been able to say in my presentation, Hegel draws far-reaching conclusions. The ethical disposition of members of civil society cannot be institutionally secured in an adequate way. People who have this disposition want to work for each other, we might say, as self-determining individuals within society's division of labor, and in this way establish their social belonging, soziale Zugehörigkeit. However, there exists no set of institutions which would satisfy both elements of this disposition, individual self-determination and social belonging. Abstract rights and markets structured by it remove many people's chances of belonging to society through employment, and the state's attempts to rectify this are at risk of missing their target and actually restricting people's entitlement to pursue employment by a process of self-determination. Since this is the case, civil societies are, in institutional and ethical respects, unstable or crisis-prone. Markets and states may lose the consent of citizens, and the ethical disposition of the people can turn into indignation and hatred, Hegel's words. Thus, the impossibility of adequately securing this disposition in institutional ways is for Hegel a fundamental problem of modern societies. Is Hegel's diagnosis, at least in its essentials, correct? Is the impossibility of adequately institutionally securing the ethical dispositions of members of civil society a fundamental problem of modern societies? In answering this question, it would be necessary first to ascertain whether individual self-determination and social belonging, in the sense I've interpreted them based on Hegel's reflections, are in fact essential components of the ethical disposition of members of modern societies, and if so, whether it really is the case that no society has institutionally secured this disposition in a satisfactory manner. Answering this question would require drawing upon facts to be established by history and social science. If the answer is yes, it raises a further question. Is it in fact impossible to adequately institutionally secure these two elements? Or is it merely the case that this has hitherto never been achieved or has been prevented in some way? Do individual self-determination and social belonging constitute, as I assumed throughout my talk, fixed components of the ethical dispositions of members of modern societies? Or can they be sublated, aufgehoben, in a more complex and ethically acceptable disposition which has its own, potentially satisfiable, institutional requirements? These are some of the questions with which Hegel's social diagnosis confronts us. Thank you.